I'm Charlie Swenson. This is the podcast To Hell and Back. I know it's like the 65th or 70th one, amazingly. It's January 16th, 2020, and it's 6 o'clock in the Eastern time zone. We have a really cool thing we're going to do at least my idea of cool, for these next 3 meetings, today, next week, and the following week. And in just a second, I'm going to introduce my colleague and friend, Seth Axelrod, and then get into a conversation with him that's going to go basically 3 hours. I have so many questions that really I should have made it 6 hours about it, but we'll see. 3 hours is pretty good. Let me say the context of this, because I realized as I got ready to do this that this is about the 6th interview out of all of my podcasts. So it's a subset of my podcasts that have a special quality to them. The first one was Domingo Marquez, who suffered through or struggled through, and very skillfully, the hurricane in Puerto Rico in September of 2017. I had one, and that went for a couple sessions. I had 2 or 3 sessions with Cedar Coons, DBT expert, mindfulness expert, who talked with us about having lost her sister to suicide and how she coped with that and how she used mindfulness and other DBT skills for that. I interviewed Melanie Harned for 3 hours. Not about her own personal experience so much as the experience of people with trauma and PTSD and how to help that. How to do that? What are the principles? I interviewed Andrea Rosenhaft for 3 hours. Andrea has coped for a long time with borderline personality disorder in all of its various forms and with different treatments for it, including DBT, but also transference-focused psychotherapy. It was a sort of an incredibly instructive things she had to say. I interviewed Natalia Garcia, who at the time was an intern or a psychology grad student from Puerto Rico. And by coincidence, on the same night as the hurricane in September of 2017, her 2-year-old son unexpectedly died in the night. And so she talked 7 months later with us for a couple hours about how she coped with that and how she used things in DBT, including exposure strategies like acting opposite her emotions in order to not avoid stuff that would remind her of her child. Incredibly helpful, inspiring. So these things sit inside me, having gone through them, and I think some of you who listen as instructive things. So basically, what am I up to with all of these? I'm up to a deep interest within myself that then takes over on these things of how do people get through adversity, hurricanes, deaths, diagnoses, all these things. How do people get knocked down and then stand up again? How do they go on when other people might stop? And within that set of questions that I've always had from the time I was a boy, I think, is the question more in my adult life of what is DBT as a vocabulary, as a dictionary essentially of tools for coping with distress and emotional dysregulation? What does it bring to bear, even if you're not in treatment, but just in your own life when you run into adversity that's knocking you down? So that's really what these are about. And you know, that brings me around towards the one that we're going to do now, because Seth Axelrod, first of all, is an esteemed colleague and a kind of a new friend for me. I've known him for a long time from a distance, but this has created an opportunity for me to begin to talk with Seth and just feel like there's a lot of things in common, a lot of sense of immediate connection. But Seth is the director of DBT. He's a clinical psychologist, a PhD, an associate professor at Yale University. Is it School of Medicine? Is it within the medical school that you're a professor, associate professor?
Yes.
Yeah. And he runs DBT services there, different programs. He has run conferences for a long time there every year with Perry Hoffman and NEA-BPD about borderline personality disorder that bring together experts and professionals and researchers with family members and with clients who struggle through these things in an extraordinary kind of thing. I was at one of them. I wish I had been at more. I said some things at one of them and watched the rest of it. So he's done that. And he's been for many years a trainer and consultant through behavioral tech in DBT training in lots of places. So Seth has all of that to his name, and all of that would be enough to bring him to this interview and this conversation. However, he also, for 6 years, has contended with a cancer diagnosis and the manifestations of cancer and the consequences of cancer and the treatments of cancer and the complications of that in his life, his personal life, his family life, his professional life. And he's still going. And you know, as cancers go, as he'll probably tell us a little more about this, he has a bad cancer. He has a cancer that he wouldn't have necessarily thought he'd be alive at this point. And he's still dealing with it. I'll let him decide within his own personal limits how much he wants to say about that. But it's still going on. He's still, right up to this week, he's still dealing with it. He's still making decisions about it. He's still coping with the manifestations and the uncertainty of it all. And so, you know, who better to talk to? A DBT expert who's coping with sort of like a hurricane that started from within, and that really is frightening just to hear, but then to hear about it, you know, the details. The whole thing as a big thing, and I have lots of questions about this, just coping with the fact that you now know you have cancer when you've never known that before. Like, that's like a huge life transition. But then actually having it and telling one's family and telling one's spouse and telling one's colleagues and supervisees and telling one's clients at whenever you need to. It's like, oh my God, I mean, just stack these things up. So that's what we're going to talk about for 3 hours. That's why we've given ourselves 3 hours, because there's a lot to talk about. And I've had to think about, you know, so that's Seth in a nutshell, and just to get started. And I have some prompting sort of ideas and questions just to get started. But actually, the way these things go, if you've tuned into any of these interviews, I have no idea where we're going to end up. I really don't. So it's just sort of some, what I'll call base camps, actually questions that, but we're going to wander into the woods from each base camp and see what we get to. And I'm going to be interested all the way along in how Seth has applied DBT principles, strategies, and skills, as well as other things to cope with this, and how is he using, because I think this could be of interest way beyond people who are listening in who have cancer or are close to someone who have cancer, because it's also just, how do you apply mindfulness to adversity? How do you apply wise mind to adversity? How do you apply radical acceptance from DBT, one of the biggest skills, to adversity? And how do you apply tolerating distress with crisis survival strategies to this? And how do you apply coping ahead and all these other things that when you open up DBT's toolbox, it kind of goes on and on and on. So we'll get into whatever we can get into. So Seth, welcome. I'm so appreciative that you're willing to join us.
Thank you, Charlie. I'd like to say I'm filled with gratitude for the opportunity to do this. I so appreciate what you do with the podcast, and I really appreciate your invitation. And I've thought for a long time, I often think about how much to share and when to share. And in some ways I've been extremely open. In other ways, most often people don't know what's happening with me. And I'm really looking forward to this challenge of sorting through this in this kind of personal way with you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this unfolds. I've been reflecting a lot since I talked to you originally about this possibility, and then you invited me, and my mind just keeps going in different directions of things that could be discussed. And so I'm kind of looking forward to sharing, and also I appreciate your leading us through the things that strike you as we kind of go through this. But everything you said, I connect with. You know, the introduction I really appreciate, because I think it really captured the experience of that, of using these principles, using other things, trying to draw from them, and my hope that this does offer something to people, not only what you said, not only for cancer, but in general. One thing I shared with you, that for years before I had this diagnosis, and I was practicing DBT and teaching these skills, and one thing I would say is that this is a toolkit. These are tools to deal with whatever life sends you. And now here I am. And when the diagnosis came, that was what occurred to me almost immediately, was, okay, now I can put my money where my mouth is. What am I going to do? And I went to my skills. Was a starting point.
You're already, the first thing I was going to ask is what prompted you to actually be willing to come on. It's different to talk to somebody you know about what's going on with you than to get on a podcast. As I've learned, I'm talking and I have no idea who's listening now, who's going to listen next week, who's going to listen next year. It's a weird multi-tiered audience that you can't see.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge to then say personal things. So actually, there's many ways to do it, but the fact that you and I can talk to each other is one of the answers to that.
Yeah, yeah. It's a little terrifying, you know, this idea of kind of sharing in this way. And on the other hand, when you have something like cancer, it's kind of this bombshell that people get hit with. You know, when you meet someone doesn't know, and it's like, oh, you have cancer. It's kind of this huge wall that suddenly breaks down and people are shocked by. So in some sense, one thing that occurs to me is that I will run into people are going to meet me already knowing. And in a sense, that's really helpful, because then I don't have to worry about that shock factor, because it is something, and I know we'll talk about this, that I have brought up with my clients or patients. I'm in a hospital setting, so patients generally, that I don't always raise it, but sometimes I will. And how, in a way, how nice that it's already out there, you know. And I'm also aware, something I mentioned is I do a lot of training in my setting, and I'm aware that some of those individuals I expect will hear of this. And again, how helpful for them to know, for them to hear about it, because how else do you kind of say, oh, come, you know, hi, good to meet you. I have cancer. You know, it's kind of a
good.
It's
good to meet you. I have cancer, and then have the other person say, "Could you spend 3 hours telling me about all the details?" I mean, no. People are curious, and people are avoidant. I think probably.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't had cancer, but you know, you and I talked briefly about, like, when Natalia Garcia talked about having lost her child and what a shock that was and how painful that was, and how her closest friends, who were also mothers of 2-year-olds, how she noticed that they didn't know what to say to her. And so she felt like she needed to break the ice sometimes. And she ended up, as you know, because we read it on the podcast, an amazing, inspiring letter to her mommy friends, as she called it, to tell them how to behave, you know, how to approach her, and said, please approach me. Please, when I come to your house, don't hide the photographs of your children that are on your refrigerator. I mean, don't do that. I mean, I've got to cope with things as they are. So I'm sure we'll get into that kind of stuff too. But I want to ask you one other thing, just while we're on this. Like I said, I had no idea where this would go, but now we're already somewhere. I thought it was really interesting that in the same conversation I had with you last weekend about just the whole thing, is that in the same conversation, at one point you were saying, I have a really bad diagnosis. And you also said, I have a sympathetic diagnosis compared to what some other people have. And I wonder if you could say that, because I think that was pretty interesting, especially when you consider that I've also interviewed Andrea Rosenhaft with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, cancer is one of those things that when people find out, you know, in the work setting, it gets complicated. It's a more complicated thing. In a more social setting, in a more typical setting, people hear of this diagnosis and you get showered with people wanting to rush in, wanting to help in different ways, wanting to, you know, whether it's offering rides or, you know, when the original surgeries were happening, bringing meals and those kinds of things. There's all kinds of groups around the country. Family members will, a family will lose someone to cancer and they'll start a foundation and then they'll create a weekend retreat and they'll create an organization for yacht captains to take people who are cancer survivors and families out on yachts to have a wonderful day.
Right.
And no one's doing this for borderline personality disorder.
That's a really good point.
Or any mental illness.
Make-A-Wish Foundation.
Make-A-Wish Foundation.
Relay for Life. You know, all of these things are incredibly sympathetic responses to a life-threatening illness.
Exactly, exactly. So in that sense, you know, there's, I mean, it's in my family, we have various kind of running jokes, you know, and one is the playing the cancer card. You know, I have a son who's applying for college, and there's the question, you know, does he play it? Does he not play it? And he had one interview, and he did tip the card in a context where he thought it seemed to fit, but it's, you know, but playing it is something that brings stuff, you know,
right.
and
right. I mean,
right.
but you don't know what it's going to bring. I mean,
right.
When you consider that it took, from the time she started thinking about it, took Marsha Linehan 25 or 30 years to decide to share her diagnosis and her story. If she had cancer that had done her in when she was 18 years old, she would not have needed to wait for any reason, really, except just sort of avoidance of the pain of talking about it with people or having people go through that. But it's very different, isn't it? I mean, yeah.
It's completely different. And the place where I brought it up when we were speaking was this experience that I've had in different points, particularly earlier on in the diagnosis. It still comes up now, but not quite as strongly or as frequently, of feeling invisible. You know, when I had the diagnosis, I could be out in public, or I was working, or I could go somewhere and nobody knows, you know. And even now, even though I've been through a lot of surgery, I'm reconstructed, dressed and walking around, no one can tell there's anything going on. And in that sense, it's this invisible thing. I'm carrying this thing and nobody knows, and it can feel very isolating. And I've had the experience at different points where being able to put it out there has been this this tremendous relief that, oh, now people know, now people can see me because this is something that I'm going through. And thinking again about mental illness and thinking again about borderline personality disorder, and that these individuals are so often completely invisible, that if they can kind of pass as not having a problem in the community, or they do, you know, we don't know who's dealing with what, but if they feel invisible, oh, no one knows I'm being tormented. And then what? If people find out, then people are going to run away, you know, because of stigma, because of fear, because of all these things.
Right.
And so they don't have the option of, typically. Now our conferences, which you mentioned, you know, those are like one of the few examples where, oh, look, here we're deliberately making this an okay thing to talk about and to come in with and be together. But that's such an exceptional fraction of the world, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I
And
know.
so part of me doing this podcast, I'm not at this point in my life or at this moment motivated by this need to be seen. And yet I see that as a benefit of doing this podcast is I can't imagine how I could be more exposed, you know, unless I go on from here and I continue to do other talking things, which perhaps I'll do. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, or if you went on to a real interviewer like Rachel Maddow or Anderson Cooper, and
Well, when they call, I'll think about it.
yes, right. Or Oprah when she calls you after
Yes.
doing the Lady Gaga interview.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
that she just did. Yeah. Let me ask you something else. In a way, this is like winding back chronologically, just because, you know, I'm getting to know you, and some people listening to this might actually know you better than me, but I would guess in the long run, most people won't. Could you say a little about where you came from? You know, like what you, like
Yes.
if you were at college, like your son, and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, where'd you come from? What do you do? What has your life been made up of, up to and continuing from, but especially before the cancer diagnosis came into your life?"
Sure. So going all the way back, I'm from New York. I was
Mhm.
born in New York.
I hear it in
you
your
hear it?
voice. Yes,
Okay.
I hear it in your voice. My wife's from
Okay.
New York.
Um,
It isn't radical, but it's there. You know.
It used to be stronger when I was younger,
Really? Okay.
but yeah, definitely. But I'm the younger of two boys.
Hmm.
I was in a lower middle class family in New York. We moved around some. We actually made a major move. We lived in Israel for a few years.
Mm.
I'm from a family that divorced and went in different directions. Ultimately, after quite a business, my mother and I came back to the United States. So I was a younger child, and then for quite a while I was sort of an only child with not much contact.
Because your brother didn't come back. Your
My
brother
brother
stayed.
stayed. Yeah, my brother stayed where he is now with his family. And my parents both remarried. My father had two more sons, so I have younger brothers. They eventually came to the United States. So in this country, I've become an older brother, and have positive relationships with my three brothers. We're not terribly close, but positive relationships. In high school, back in New York, I was when I first got interested in psychology, got very fascinated by that. And my plan from that point was to go on and study psychology and be a psychologist. It was pretty early on that I really
know psychologists? Did you know psychologists?
I had met one I guess I had met one psychologist at that point when I realized that's what I wanted to do. And there's an irony there in that the psychologist was back in Israel when my parents were already having trouble and already expecting to get divorced. And they brought my brother and me to a family therapy with a psychologist. And we met once or twice, and it was really not very pretty. I still have memories of my parents not being able to quite get along at that time. And then when they were going through their divorce, my parents, and custody issues, and we're still in Israel, and that was upsetting. My mother once brought me back to that same psychologist. I met with him once, and it was to talk about the fact that I was unhappy about my circumstance. And in that one meeting, his conclusions were, well, that kind of matches the circumstance, which I appreciated. But it wasn't really therapy, but that was kind of the experience. So somewhere I must have tucked that away. I don't think I thought much about that directly, but somewhere I must have tucked that away. I have an aunt who is now retired in Florida, who I loved, who was a clinical social worker.
Mhm.
So maybe that was also there somewhere, although I didn't think social work. I knew it was psychology
Yeah.
somehow.
And did you major in psychology in college?
Yes, sort of. I went to 1 year in Binghamton University,
Okay.
where I was a psychology major, but I had already had an offer to go to Cornell.
Yeah.
And my major was going to be human development and family studies, which is what I did, which
Hmm.
had a deal for New York residents. You could go to that school and get that major. But I was basically a psychology major there.
Hmm.
I spent a lot of time in psychology
Mhm.
and went straight to graduate school in psychology.
Oh, you went straight to grad school. All
Straight
right.
to, so I was pretty young. Went to University of Kentucky. That's where I met my wife.
Mhm.
Um, my other interest, along with psychology, my hobby was theater and musical theater, and that went to singing and
Oh.
choruses, and and I did that through undergraduate and continued in graduate school. And when I was taking voice lessons and singing, I met my wife. She was a voice major.
Seth,
Um,
I can't believe I didn't know this because
oh, who would?
with all of my DBT songs that I've written and perform in different places, if you and I do a training or something together, would you sing?
If I was doing it with you, absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
I got Kelly Kerner to sing at a training where she didn't know it was coming, and then she agreed to sing because before she was a psychologist, I don't know if you wouldn't, it's a little known fact about Kelly Kerner, is she would go around making money by singing at weddings.
I had no idea.
Yeah, yeah, she has
I
a great voice.
I had no idea. I had no idea.
Yeah,
Wow.
and
No, but
and it,
if we do a training, you're on.
all right, all right, good. Well, we'll have to do a couple new songs too because that's expected of all performers. I mean, you need new songs, right? So we'll do that.
Good.
When you
So
were at,
anyway, so my wife and I came to Connecticut. I came for internship. Kept doing. She and I kept performing in shows and whatnot as I was an intern and a
oh,
postdoc. She and I sang with Connecticut Opera in the opera chorus. So music is a big part of my family,
oh wow,
and in there, we have two children. They are our daughter is 19, our son just turned 17. Our daughter's a sophomore, and
hmm.
that's oh, and another piece is that when we came back to Connecticut, we got very active in the local Jewish community, where we got very active in our synagogue. We raised our children there. We are not really spiritual people in a theological sense, but we have a love for tradition and ritual and community, and we found community there.
Hmm.
So our
Yeah.
friends and our community in Connecticut have always been either in the music and theater area performing,
Hmm.
or else in our Jewish circles. Has
Hmm.
been most of kind of where we tend to find our people.
Yeah. Well, you
Yeah.
know, at another point in all of these 3 hours, I think I want to get back to among all the ways you coped with cancer, have been coping with cancer and still cope with cancer, what spiritual elements, either secularly spiritual
Yeah.
or spiritually spirit or religiously spiritual,
Yes.
because DBT has its own spiritual elements without having to sign on to any particular religion.
Yeah, I would say that if we go there, 99.9, of it, a percent would be the more that secular DBT mindfulness. There is a spiritual piece, certainly.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, but the exception piece, I think, on that more formal religious part, one thing, again, this kind of sympathetic disease, is I have had so many different people or groups pass on to me, oh, we pray for you in this church, and oh, you're on this. You know, there's in certain Jewish services, there's acknowledging the sick and praying for wellness for the sick, and my name, you know, people have shared that they personally have prayed, or this group had prayed. And it's beautiful, and I feel an appreciation for this community aspect.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really attach that to a God per se, or a divine power,
Mm-hmm.
but I do feel a spirituality around this notion of people, kind of like I'm blocking on it. I'm a little bit tired, which I get in the evenings, by the way. Incidentally, when we spoke, it was in the morning. By evening, I'm a little more, I do
Really?
wear down. Yeah, but although, which is okay.
Yeah.
But I'm blocking on the kind of prayer, the may you be happy, may you be healthy. What am I looking for? What's the words I'm looking for? The what
For
prayer?
you're looking for
The wrong prayer is coming
the heart.
to mind. It's on the tip of my tongue.
This is like embarrassing to the extreme.
Isn't it? It's terrible. Both of us now.
I do this with a sangha like every other week. I mean, I'm not gonna.
Everyone listening to this is screaming.
Everyone else knows. I know. I know. You know. And here's what's even worse. I just thought of the word Trump. I'm not going to trump you by remembering right now, but I know exactly.
It's going to pop up. One of us is going to call it out in about 2 minutes.
That's right.
5 minutes.
That's right. Hey, a question. You were at University of Kentucky. Remind me, because you told me at one point in time, and I forget exactly the nature, you encountered Cindy Sanderson?
I did.
At that point or after that?
Well, so I encountered Cindy Sanderson at the University of Kentucky. She had already left. I don't know if she was on internship when I got there, or she had just finished internship, but she was a few years ahead of me.
I see.
So we weren't students at the same time. However, I went there because to study personality disorders. Tom Whittaker was and still is there, and there was, you know, so to really dive into in an academic way, understanding personality disorders, it was a great match for me. Yeah. And I also wanted to look at personality disorders clinically, and that was right around the time that Marcia's work had come out. I started graduate school in '92, and so when I was in my practicum, and was looking for, well, what options are there for working with personality disorders, someone said, oh, well, there's this new thing that just came out. Take a look at this.
Right.
And the supervisors I had and I really were not comprehending what we were looking at. And I was trying and I was doing things, but it was bad. It was, I'll use a judgment. It certainly wasn't effective.
Right, right.
And then as I was trying to sort out what this was, for whatever reason, Cindy came back and did a one-day DBT training.
Oh.
And suddenly I was hearing someone talk about this and frame this and demonstrate mindfulness and have us practice in ways that suddenly made more sense, and there was you know, I got to taste a little bit of what are we actually talking about here. Right. So it was very significant. It was very significant. Yeah. And then I encountered her once or twice after that. I was very aware of her. Yeah. I was aware of if, you know, anything that she wrote, I would notice, you know, I would have an eye out.
Yeah, well, you know, I certainly neglected in the opening introduction. I realize now that on top of everything else I said about you professionally, that in November you won this award with the International Society for Improvement and Teaching of DBT, ISITDBT. and you won the award, which is only given every 2 or 3 years. There's probably only 7 or 8 people that have gotten it. And it's the Cindy Sanderson Outstanding Educator Award in DBT internationally. And so it's like so cool that that came back around to you.
It really added a lot. It makes it very significant, very poignant. I also had a very strong memory, I think I mentioned to you, of I was present when you received the first Cindy Sanderson Educator Award. And that was a very moving experience to be there when you got that award. So for me, there really isn't a higher honor.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
You know, and yours is a higher honor than mine. Yours is more legit because I was one of the 2 founders of the organization. So for me to get that award is like, there must have been a lot of conflict of interest going on. So, you know,
I'm going to push past I am not going to validate the invalid in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, look, my next question is really, so you now live in Connecticut, you work in New Haven at Yale New Haven Hospital. You live, as you told me last time, 30 minutes outside of New Haven. You have a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old host. So when you were diagnosed, they were 13 and 11.
Yeah.
Something like that, close to that, right? And a boy and a girl. And the boy is now trying to get into college. The girl's already a sophomore at college.
Yeah.
And okay. And so there you were, you're going along. And what started to happen that gave you a clue, something might be wrong? Or did it just come up incidentally in a laboratory examination or something?
No, it was about a year before the diagnosis. So going 1 year earlier than that, I started to develop chronic pain in my upper back on the right side, and also on my chest on the right side. Started to get these kind of terrible knot-like experiences, and in the front, there was also, I try to remember when it started. At some point, it turned into these kind of shock experiences, kind of like a shooting. Pain would occur, and that was kind of mysterious. It came on. I couldn't figure out. Something's happening with the sound. Are you hearing me okay?
No, okay. Yeah, there is something happening. So, somebody is not muted. Okay,
I think they muted. I think they okay. So I started to have this chronic pain, this daily, almost continuous pain, and then sometimes it would get worse. And for a while, I didn't know if I didn't know what was going on. Around the same time, my wife unfortunately had shingles. She had a pain thing going on.
Oh, that can be terrible. Yeah.
So yeah, she really, I mean, she got through it, but she was less able to take care of the kid, the cooking, and or things that she would do more normally. She was kind of laid out. So I was having this pain. I'm kind of ignoring it. It's getting worse. She starts getting better. She starts recovering. I start seeing doctors. I start making appointments after probably about 3 months of kind of going through this. And it was very mysterious, but they noticed that one of my ribs was a little bit dislocated. It was kind of not quite in place.
Were you thinking cancer at that point?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, they noticed this rib was dislocated. They say it's unusual, but it can happen. They put me in physical therapy. Saw a physical therapist for quite a while, who would try different things, and it would seem like, well, maybe that's a little better, but then it wasn't. I started seeing different doctors, trying, saw chiropractor at one point, trying different things. And and then I saw a physiatrist, like a sports medicine kind of doctor. Different people kind of trying this. meanwhile, the pain did start turning into this shooting pain that would sometimes occur that really became debilitating in that if I was driving, it seemed that the way I was sitting would push on something in some way. And I could get these like shocks that got severe to the point that I would have to pull over if it started, if it was like really shooting. It was intermittent, but I got to points where I couldn't focus on the road because of what I was being hit with. And then there was a point where coming home from work, I ended up pulling over and I wasn't sure if I could get home.
Wow.
I had started consulting and training with behavioral tech. I actually did my first intensive. It wasn't an issue. I was having the pain, but it wasn't a really big issue during the part 1. But the part 2 was when things were really getting out of control. And I did that with Tony
DeBose, yeah.
And so you know, we went back and forth, but I wasn't sleeping really at that point. And then the physiatrist finally said, okay, let's get an MRI. Let's see what's happening. You know, let's see if there's something going on here.
So from the beginning of symptoms until you got an MRI, how long was that?
That was almost a year.
Wow.
That was about a year. Yeah.
So you still didn't have a diagnosis?
No, well, it was a dislocated rib.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it was really, really unclear. And then when we got it imaged, then it was suddenly obvious that there was something else going on, that underneath the rib was a tumor, and the tumor was on the spine, kind of toward the inside in the upper and the thoracic spine. And it was right kind of behind that rib. So the rib's sticking out a little bit in the back. You can't see anything of the tumor because it's on the underside.
Right.
So the tumor was, it was kind of an odd shape, but it was kind of 3 centimeters by, at the longest, I think about 6 or 7 centimeters, kind of going along the rib, but mostly on the vertebra. And at that point, my wife and I were kind of terrified.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I was just about to comment that you've been living with this story for so long, but then when you tell it, I think, holy shit. I mean,
exactly.
if I learned that after thinking I had a dislocated rib and other things, which is bad enough, oh my God, it would be like,
what's that thing? And this bizarre looking thing, I got to see the thing. It's just this kind of weird mushroom-like, what is this like odd creature going on over there? And one possibility, now it still wasn't clear, was this cancer. This could be a cancerous thing. This could be a benign tumor, but there was some kind of tumor there. And that led me to start to see an orthopedic surgeon. And the orthopedic surgeon was not sure, you know, is this cancer or not, but we'll get a biopsy. Either way, he was already talking surgery. You know, that's something we're going to have to get out of there one way or another. But that was, it was one MRI, another MRI, I think about 2 days later, because they do it without contrast, but then they do it with contrast to see it better somehow. And then it was about a week later, or I think a few days later, of doing a biopsy. And then almost a week later, getting here's the diagnosis. In the meanwhile, I work at a university. I've got access to medical journals. I'm searching, I'm looking at different kinds of, you know, orthopedic, spine, you know, diagnostic articles and chapters, and I have no idea what I'm looking at. I'm a psychologist. So I'm looking at pictures that superficially look like what I've got, trying to figure, is this, that, or, you know, the other. Not, you know, so I probably saw about 10 different or 12 different diagnoses floating around, some cancerous, some not. One thing that happened around this time, I was, by the way, very open. One thing I did, even at that time, is I was on Facebook. I have, you know, some security settings on my Facebook, so it's not a public Facebook. But we were kind of freaking out, and I just went ahead and put this on the Facebook. Hey, here's it. You know, I called my parents, you know, hey, this thing's going on. But for most of kind of putting the word out, you know, kind of letting anyone know, I put it there. Somehow it seemed very clear to me that letting our kind of community, letting friends know we're going through something was a good idea. It was really an unusual thing for me to do. I haven't been somewhere, you know, the Facebook was a place to mostly post about the kids so the grandparents can see them, and, you know,
right.
Not a big poster. You know, I would look and see, but wouldn't post much.
Right.
But I did post this.
Yeah.
You know, have this thing, gotta have a biopsy, gotta figure out what it is. I would just kind of put all that in there.
But that's interesting about you, Seth, that you went in that direction. It's not like you're usually a public person about your personal life. It doesn't sound like, but something in you reached for community.
Yes.
Something you reached for social connection, for, you know, whatever that would bring.
Yeah.
I think, you know, and when I've done these other interviews with people facing really catastrophic events or things in their lives, this is always, where in DBT, people focus so much on behavior and actions and what you can do about your emotions, all of which is incredibly helpful. But, you know, there's an what do you call it? Underemphasis on just reaching out to social connections, which of course everybody would agree is a good idea. But the more I do these kind of interviews with people, this comes up. Two things come up now that I think of it over and over again. And you've already brought one of them up in your own way, which is humor. Humor, which is not a listed skill in DBT, but actually it's huge. It's humor, and then also socializing or reaching for social support.
Humor is one that I've been thinking about a lot in preparation for this, because humor has been a huge piece of the coping with this. And, you know, and in DBT, you know, there's some things you can find in DBT, but they are understated or they are kind of minimized. You know, humor is, as best I can figure, shows up in the wise mind accepts distracting with emotions, you know, or maybe, I mean, you're kind of, maybe.
Yeah. You try to get something going where that's funny rather than tragic or rather than sad.
I get, you know, because I definitely, there's a lot of, you know, for my own coping, my family's coping, when I've been interacted within the cancer community, and I do have various connections that I've made at different times, I mean, still very active in the cancer community. In person, it's amazing how much laughter there is and joking around when you put a bunch of cancer patients together. It's remarkable.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, I agree with you. I agree. The humor I see is those two things you just said.
Yeah.
And then also the easy manner part, which I know we're going to talk about in terms of giving it, you know, talking to other people about it.
Yeah.
Humor has been huge for lightening up, being able to talk about, you know, painful things.
So you got this diagnosis, and after all that time, and now, of course, in one way things made sense, but it was, I assume, terrifying just to begin with, and then your fear must not have gone down when you learned the nature of your tumor.
Yeah. Now there was one really interesting kind of twist. There's so many twists and turns, but there was one that was really kind of fascinating from kind of a coping perspective.
Yeah.
When I had the tumor and I had the kind of the scare, I also shared it with work. I also told my supervisors, you know, hey, this thing's going on. I'm getting, you know, because also I, you know, had to get MRIs and be out for this and whatever. And I had one supervisor, an esteemed psychiatrist, he's retired now, William Sledge.
Oh, I knew him well. I knew him well when I was at Yale. Yeah.
Okay. Well, he was the chief of psychiatry at the hospital. And I happened to have a meeting with him and shared about, we shared about what was going on. And he gave me this theory about that, the way mechanically, if we think about the way the rib is kind of rubbing against the vertebra, that could create something, and that would almost be like a callus. And he really looks at this, and he's not a specialist in this area, but what
Right.
he sees is a benign kind of thing that occurred through this frictional process and da da da
Right.
da.
Yeah.
And I had this wonderful sense of relief, and I shared it with my wife, and the two of us got to have this like relaxed weekend, because I think it was on a Friday, and we both knew, like this, we don't, he doesn't necessarily know what he's talking about.
Right.
But here's this theory that something else could be happening.
Right.
And from that weekend, and then the days we were waiting for the results, and we got it. When we got the results, it was cancer. And it's a bone cancer that I can label. We weren't shocked. We were scared. We were aware this very well could be cancer.
Yeah.
But there was this really remarkable way of not getting ahead of ourselves by getting this message that kind of, we don't really know, who knows, what it is. So it was a really remarkable thing that we went from kind of a panic mode to not being so panicked. And then when we did get hit with it, that was a huge blow. But we kind of already had the shock from the first place of seeing the tumor and struggling with all the, is that cancer? Is that cancer?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
okay, it is. So it was a painful. There was a shock and kind of a numbed, but in some ways less so than the first hearing about it and jumping to.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. I think this is one stage of everything you've been through, was first learning your diagnosis, or first thinking, maybe I have something. Somebody says you have a tumor. That's already step one now. Oh, a tumor. That's a different idea. Of course, Will Sledge gave you a little relief, saying, well, maybe a tumor is caused by this rubbing of bone, and the bone osteoclasts, which
Right.
create bone, created a big bone tumor, which is benign or something. So I understand, but I think a lot of people go through this with whether they're getting a diagnosis of some form of cancer or leukemia or diabetes or how bad is their asthma? Is this asthma that might kill them? So many, a neurological condition, like a lot of people my age who are forgetting things. Oh no, do I have Alzheimer's? Do I have a dementia or something? Or is this just normal? I mean, you go back and forth. There's a whole period of turmoil that's really hard to tolerate just there. And then when you land on a diagnosis, you hope it's not going to be a bad one. So you're looking for a way out, because it's sort of like cancer is stalking you.
Yes. Yeah. But he felt so terrible when it turned out to be cancer. He felt so off, and I had to let him know. He gave us such a gift.
That's so nice of you to tell him that. I mean, as I remember, Will, it's a long time ago, but he was not chairman then, but he was the head of education, and he was a very decent person too. I'm sure that he was totally well-intended, but people say things when they're totally well-intended, when you're potentially on the edge of a cliff in your life, and people say, oh, you're not really that close to the edge of the cliff. And you're thinking, oh, that's nice of you to say, but it's actually bullshit. I mean, not that but it is kind of like false hope. You're looking for anything at that point. It works for a moment.
It was. And we were in DBT, thinking about crisis survival versus reality acceptance. We were in a crisis survival kind of place. We were in a crisis state. It was a false hope. It was but we kind of, I think it was kind of an adaptive denial. We knew we knew that there was no truth to what was being said. It was a theory. It was one guy's one psychiatrist's
A psychiatrist of all
theory.
things, right? Who's going to believe a psychiatrist about cancer?
Right.
I know.
And yet it gave us a story that was helpful at that point, that we appreciated.
Gave you a story. You know, you and I were talking last weekend. We only have a few minutes left. By the way, somebody wrote in the name of that form of meditation.
Oh, of course they did. What is it?
Yeah. And the person who wrote in is somebody you've met before, is Beth McCrave.
Oh,
I don't know if you know Beth from New Hampshire.
You, Beth.
Yeah. So Beth, it's meta meditation.
Meta meditation. No, there's another word too. Loving kindness. I got it.
Loving kindness. Yeah, that's another word.
Thank you, Beth.
Right. Yes.
What I couldn't come up with was a loving kindness prayer.
That's right. Loving kindness.
There we go.
Right. So obviously we're going to be ending this podcast with, okay, this is the story up to now. And so I just want to ask you, I guess, at the end of that, using this technical term that isn't that helpful, but I'm groping for a term. What kind of dysregulation did this add to what you were going through? I mean, did it add hope because, oh, maybe this is a cancer, somebody can now do something they're going to do, or was it just purely like, oh my God?
There was a dropping experience. There was like the floor dropped of, you know, it was really kind of the nightmare has happened, you know, because it was this stretch. You know, we went from this mystery problem, it's been going on for a year, to, oh, who cares about pain? This might be cancer. And by the way, that's been a back and forth over the years between, I'm in chronic pain, but is pain important? Cancer is actually more important than pain.
Oh yeah, wow.
So there was that transition.
That's right.
Then there was the terror of it, and then it was the floor dropping out. And at the same time, in getting the diagnosis, there was the opportunity to notice the possibility of acceptance. Because before there, it was the only thing to accept was the uncertainty. And I still, there's a lot of, in my world, there's a lot of accepting uncertainty. There's lots of uncertainties to accept. But at that point, there was this, this horrible thing was labeled, and there was both the possibility of studying it, you know, for me to jump back in my journals, which I didn't do immediate. I don't know if I did it on that day or not. I certainly did it quickly. But on that day, there was absolutely noticing I can work on radically accepting having a cancer diagnosis, because that was so far out of the realm of possibility. You know, the tumor being there was so far out of the realm of possibility, but then it is not a benign growth, but cancer was something that I, on the day, could start making the turn from crisis mode to acceptance.
Even with the uncertainty and accepting the uncertainty of it. And one of the things I'm going to ask you about in more detail next time, which I think is going to be helpful to everybody I know, because I still run skills groups, and my skills groups, it's every time you teach radical acceptance. What exactly does that mean? And how exactly do you do that? And of course, in the manual, there's a series of steps now in the second edition of the manual. But even after that, people are stuck with, everyone gets the idea of radical acceptance, but oh my God, to really get at what it meant to you and how much of that you've had to practice, I think I'll ask you next time to, you know, go over with us in some detail that. So much as I hate to defer this another 167 hours, we now have to stop for that many hours before we resume this conversation. And I want to encourage people who listen or watch to write in any emails you want, to give feedback, and to throw in questions if you do this within the next week or so, or two. Throw in questions that you wish I would bring up. And also you can certainly email me at my website where you get some of this, or at c.robert.swenson@gmail.com. Seth, are you open to anybody directly emailing you about any questions?
Sure. My email's easy. Seth Axelrod at Yale .edu.
Okay, thanks for being willing to do that. Yeah, so feel free to write anything. And even if this is after all of these podcasts are done, getting the feedback is really helpful. So we've sort of laid the framework by getting to the point where you are have been diagnosed and now you're beginning to cope with that. And we'll come back and pick up somewhere there along with anything else that comes up in either of our minds in the next week, okay? And thanks, Seth. Bye.